Welcome to this episode of Washington in Focus. I'm TJ Martinell. With me is Carlene Johnson. There's a state committee that was considering setting up a buyer's club for people to consume illegal drugs, and it seems like they've backed away from that. Carlene, what's going on?
Yeah, this is pretty crazy. I think they got a lot of media attention and might be trying to distance themselves from this subgroup's recommendations. So to back up a little bit, in June, late June, the Substance Use Recovery Services Advisory Committee, long thing, acronym SURSAC, they announced that this work group that was their recommendation, the formulation of a work group a couple years ago, had come up with recommendations. And there were 4 recommendations, perhaps the most controversial of which was to set up basically a buyer's club to put the state kind of in the drug dealing business, if you will. And the argument being it's sort of the harm reduction model, which I know you're familiar, we've written about, right? The idea being, okay, you've got these drug addicts on the street that are dying because they're buying a couple of pills, they think or whatever, but they might be laced with, lethal doses of fentanyl, whatever, like there's any safe dose of fentanyl. But the idea is, okay, let's make sure that they're getting their illegal hardcore drugs from the state so we can ensure the safety of their drug supply.
So I just want to make sure I understand. The state would be openly possessing illegal drugs. So would the DEA have the authority or the grounds for arresting members of the state officials?
You could jump to that not too far out conclusion, especially given the current administration. I don't think that the Trump administration would look very fondly on the state of Washington becoming a drug dealer.
You got to wonder which drug cartel put them up to this idea.
Right, exactly. Who stands to benefit? So the updated, so that got a lot of bad press. We covered it, wrote about it, and that story got picked up by a lot of, our media partners. And it was talked about on, podcasts and got a lot of traction, even some national coverage. And so they had a meeting on Monday, again, this SURSAC committee, and the upshot of it, I'm watching it, and it is about 15 minutes into the meeting. The chair says, well, I just need to address something before we get into the other agenda items today. Address the fact that some of the media coverage of what the work group recommendations were sort of conflated that and made it sound like those were our recommendations. And so he was going, whoa. This ain't us.
This reminds me very much of a story I wrote a couple of years ago about the Sex Offender Policy Board, where I noted from one of their documents a recommendation that they were looking at, and they said the exact same thing. Well, that wasn't ours. And when we asked them, so what's wrong with the story, they didn't have anything to say.
Well, so you're 100% right. And he even brought up in the meeting, and TJ, he linked so here's the chair running this meeting on Monday. And he's telling other members of SURSAC, and there's a dozen and a half members, maybe even some new members, that were there for the first time for the Monday meeting. And he says, I just want to make sure you understand that these reports of the media, some of them got it wrong because they said these were SURSAC recommendations. They're not. It was the subgroup that we suggested come up with recommendations, but it wasn't that. But then he also he failed in that explanation to then say what was wrong. He linked our article, the centersquare.com article that I worked on, as evidence in the chat message to other members of the fact that some people had gotten it wrong. And he also indicated that their media liaison, I don't have that person's name, had attempted to correct misinformation. I never got contacted.
Hey, that's the question I was going to ask. Did they contact you? Because that's the thing is, you always ask them, so what's factually inaccurate about this story? And it just seems like what's going on is a lot of these agencies and a lot of these committees, some of them can be really obscure, or they're just, there's not enough media around. So they're not used to having the level of scrutiny that we at the Center Square are beginning to provide for them. So this is why transparency and accountability and media coverage matters, because so much stuff is going on that people don't know about. And the only reason they get away with it is because people don't know about it.
Well, and that you're 100% right. And I searched again on Wednesday to see if anybody else had covered this follow-up meeting that was on Monday. This is summertime. People aren't paying attention to normal consumption of media as they do, right? But I don't think anybody else watched this follow-up meeting or paid attention whatsoever. The fact that, here he was going, by the way, media reports got it wrong. We're not going to say how they got it wrong. But by the way, that wasn't our recommendation. We're not saying we would or would not endorse it, but we're kind of.
Well, and that's the other thing is it was somebody else's recommendation. Okay. What do you guys think of this idea?
Well, that was it. And that was unfortunate that it didn't come up. This was what was fascinating to me. So one of the new members, I mentioned there was a couple of new members, I think actually 3 new members that joined the SURSAC committee. Their first meeting was Monday. One, Representative Brian Wenatchee, obviously conservative member, but you also had Representative Mari Levitt, Stillicum area, Pierce County. She's kind of positioning herself to be a little bit more moderate at this point, but certainly more liberal in most of her votes this past session. She was the one who started asking the chair, okay, wait a minute, I'm a new member, so help me understand what was truth and what were lies in the media coverage. And are we washing our hands of this subgroup that recommends a buyer's club for drugs? Are we really distancing ourselves from that point? He didn't answer the questions. And I spoke with Representative Levitt on Tuesday to kind of get her take. I said, well, based on the line of questioning I saw you pose and the lack of clarity in the responses from the chair, are you satisfied? And she said, absolutely not. She will have a follow-up meeting. She said, I want to understand, what happens with these recommendations now?
Right.
They go to lawmakers. We know what the leanings are in Olympia. They go to lawmakers and they can adopt them.
I think what's can get lost in all of this is people can say this was a subgroup or wasn't something there. Why is this even being proposed? It's saying that it's proposing that Washington State and taxpayers become drug deal sellers to people who are drug addicts. I don't understand how this is even a topic of discussion. It's like it's like, I'm trying to think of a comparison, but it's sort of like giving people free lottery tickets who have a gambling addiction.
Gambling problem.
It's paid for by taxpayers because we want to control their gambling or something like that. But it's such a weird way of looking at how to deal with a drug problem. But also it's the state's not spending the money. It's taxpayers being forced to do it. And it's interesting how the people who would be forced to pay for it, if they do drugs, they're the ones, they get to go to jail. It seems like there's this category of people where they can break the law, and instead of being arrested or facing criminal prosecution or being forced into treatment, they're being subsidized by taxpayers.
And I think that's a really good point, TJ, because one of the things I spoke to Representative Brian Burnett on Tuesday as well. He's one of the other new members I mentioned on the SURSAC committee. And he said what goes through his mind is the fact that the legislature spent $300,000. They appropriated it in 2023, I believe, for this subgroup, sub work. So SURSAC recommends we need a work group that comes up with recommendations on how we approach this problem. And so this subgroup comes up with recommendations, one of them being a buyer's club. Let's get the state into the drug dealing business. And that cost $300,000 for this work group. Now, most of that was paid to a third-party contractor who then worked with the office of former Governor Jay Inslee to appoint members of this work group. These were folks that came from recovery housing. So, drug addict housing, you get clean, or maybe not in Washington, low barrier, no barrier housing, right? And folks that are in recovery, folks with lived experience, recovered addicts themselves. These were the members of the work group that came up with these. That was $300,000. Mind you, this is coming at a time when the state couldn't fund $100,000 for the center in Kent to help.
That is very fascinating. Yeah. They couldn't fund a school, a care center for kids who were born to drug addicts, but they have money to give to drug addicts. It's almost like the cartels are running the state.
Well, yeah, I don't want to go that far, but yes, I encourage readers to check out the story at thecentersquare.com, because there are links to some of the SURSAC recommendations, some of the work group recommendations, and the meeting in its entirety. People can judge for themselves what they think about, the direction of the state and where things are going. But I promise you, I'm not done paying attention to this issue.
We'll definitely be interested in more that you have to report on, Carlene. Listeners can keep up with this and other stories at thecentersquare.com. I'm your host, TJ Martinell, and thank you for listening to Washington in Focus.